Thumbs up. Um, I'm not sure who's all joining from. I know that Patrick had to go. There's Tyler coming in and Lindsay coming in. Yeah, we'll just wait another minute or so. So again, just to remind everyone, we'll have an hour and a half session till what, 3 o'clock, then a half hour break, and then another hour and a half. So it seems like a lot of time, but I'm sure I'll use it all up. That's my tendency. Let's just take a moment to come back into this space and generate a good motivation. We won't do a full meditation on this, but it's always nice to remind ourselves of why we're here. And we can even briefly review what I covered at the very beginning of the first session. That every one of us, every single sentient being, is under the control of their own ignorance in particular, going about creating all these various states of mind, experiencing the karma, having created the karma and then experiencing the results and so on. And this is happening to every single being. And we need to be free of this ourselves to remove this ignorance if we are ever to know any sort of peace. But moreover, if we go on to achieve Buddhahood on the basis of this wisdom, then we can help others to do the same, can bring them to their own fulfillment, to their deepest potential. So ideally, this is why we're here today, to create this wisdom ourselves as best as we can, so we then can help others to do the same. Okay. All right. So any questions from anything this morning now that you've had some time to digest the teachings and begin to digest your meal? So anything? No? Okay, so let's carry on. Again, at the end of the morning session, we were really working, moving in this direction of what we call, again, dependent arising or interdependent arising. When I titled this Simplifying Emptiness, I already, of course, had that in mind because it's said to be kind of the easier or more gentle approach to getting to emptiness. And as I was pointing out at the end of the morning session, essentially what we're trying to do is if we understand how things do exist in a dependent manner, then we have denied that they can exist in an independent manner. Over lunch, we got in, Patrick said, is it possible to uh, affirm something and by virtue of that realize the negation of something else? And I was like, that's what we're talking about, essentially with dependent arising. We are going to set out the way in which things arise, come into existence on the basis of various factors. And then, of course, if that's how they come into existence, if that's how everything exists, then they cannot possibly exist independently. Independent existence is canceled. So you're kind of going to realize a negation of that independent existence, what we again call what we're grasping at with our ignorance, as if things like this spoon had its own spoonness. It exists then in an independent matter. It doesn't depend upon us calling it spoon or, having the function of spoon or all the things that we do to relate to this as spoon. But we know if we analyze that, yes, it can't exist independent of that because once more, even with the example of the ant or any other animal that's going to relate to this, except maybe that chimpanzee that learned how to use a spoon or something. But essentially, we're going to see that there's a very different experience of the ant on the spoon than what we have. The ant's not going to know spoon or function of spoon or what have you. It's going to just see it as like, oh, clean surface I'm crawling on now that has food remnants. Interesting. Maybe that's what it'll do. I don't know. I don't know ant language, but it's something along those lines. Pardon? Skate rink, yeah, maybe. Something like that. Or if there was water in it, maybe a swimming pool, something. But let's go to my slides then. I've got a few things I want to do here, and then we will be sharing a few more videos here and there. We'll see how this all goes from current slide. I think this was where we ended then at the morning session. So I don't know that I need to repeat that. I'll just, yeah, leave it at that. I do want to mention that Thich Nhat Hanh, many of you know of the great Vietnamese Zen master who passed away just a few years ago. He refers to interdependent, he calls it interdependent arising to begin with, but then he refers to it with this very rich term that's interbeing. Everything, and he used it in particularly, I'm sorry, around the environment. The environment, if we start seeing it as a product of interbeing, then we don't see ourselves as some sort of independent being that's just there enjoying nature and taking advantage of nature. We actually understand the way in which everything is intimately involved with everything else. I'm going to put on screen a little passage that I located. Um, I know he talks about this in many of his books, and this may even be from one of his books. Let me see if I can find that up here. Is it up? Yeah, it is up. There it is. It's with the prayers. That's why I can't see it. Just have to pull up the article. So it's that paragraph in the middle of the screen there. It says, looking into a flower, we can see that it is full of life. This is why I was referring to this whole thing about the seeing the fullness that is within emptiness. It contains soil, rain, and sunshine. It is also full of clouds, oceans, and minerals. It is even full of space and time. In fact, the whole cosmos is present in this one little flower. If we took out just one of these non-flower elements, the flower would not be there. Without the soil's nutrients, the flower could not grow. Without rain and sunshine, the flower would die. And if we removed all the non-flower elements, there would be nothing substantive left that we could call a flower. So our observation tells us that the flower is full of the whole cosmos, while at the same time it is empty of a separate self-existence. The flower cannot exist by itself alone. So this was his concept again that he describes as interbeing, that when we look at something, he would sometimes use like a piece of paper. You hold up a piece of paper and you say, when you see the piece of paper, you should see all the similar types of things. You see the sunshine and the tree that the wood pulp was taken from, and the rain that gave rise to all of that. And of course, once more, you start getting into this whole vein of looking at the causes and conditions that lead to any particular phenomenon, and you find that they're infinite. I remember one passage I saw from Carl Sagan, the scientist. I don't know, he was interested in cosmology. He did that series on PBS called The Cosmos. He said that if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you have to invent the universe. And in a sense, we'd have to, like the Dalai Lama has said often when he's meeting with the scientists, you'd have to invent what came before the universe too, for that matter, because the universe didn't come from nowhere. That's the whole thing of dependent arising, is everything is coming from something else. There's no original thing that everything comes from. So yeah, it's a nice way to put it, that if you do want to actually build, bake an apple pie from scratch, you have to start where? I mean, in Buddhist terms, you wouldn't even be a place to start, because there is no scratch. There is no original thing that you are kind of beginning from. But it does kind of point out the fact that everything is interrelated, everything is interdependent. So the Buddha actually taught that there are kind of three levels of interdependence. And I'm going to teach them in the traditional order. When we meditate on them later, I think we might do what Scott Snebe says, which is to actually start with the middle one and then work through the first and the third. But to do that, I'm going to use a little prop here that I have, and that maybe one of you, Andrew or Marty, would you mind? These come off just by taking that off of there. Yeah, if everyone could have one. You don't necessarily need to engage in this little exercise if you don't want to. And I'm sorry, those online. What people are getting is an object that looks like this. If we could switch the camera now, Leah, to mine. An object that looks like this. Does everyone see it? I'm intentionally not giving it a name, but I think we all know the name of this phenomenon. Yes? Anyone who doesn't? And if again, you don't have to necessarily work with the one that you have here in the Gompa, but if you know, you can take it with you if you'd like as a reminder of the teachings, a little souvenir of some sort. You kind of redesignate it. Thank you, Andrew, for doing that. So let's go to the slides, and I'm just going to introduce this topic of how we're going to approach a dependent arising in these three levels. So we're going to talk about again, it's one's on the screen as well, these three levels of dependent arising. The very first one is dependence upon causes and conditions. And we don't need to really do much with the clothespin at this point. But again, this is what we refer to as a clothespin. I found it kind of interesting. The first time that I used this at the center in Santa Fe, there was one student that was there, and about a month or two later, he came in and he said, "Oh, I was traveling and I bought a National Geographic, and they actually had like the history of the clothespin, like different things that were called clothespin. That there was a display at the Smithsonian Institute or something on, and so I mean, I remember when I was growing up, my mother had clothes pegs that weren't really with the spring. It was more of just a one piece of wood that went on the line like that. So clothespin obviously is a loose term that we give to, phenomenon that has all this. We're going to see its definition a little bit later. But the idea is when we see a clothespin, we essentially are talking about something that has many causes and conditions, just like the flower that Thich Nhat Hanh was talking about, right? So the two that I put on there are what we sometimes refer to as the more substantial causes. Like substantial causes means the sort of substance or main thing from which that is generated. So we have the two wooden pegs and we have the little metal spring. So I essentially put there on the left-hand side some wood that is obviously from trees that is then, shaped into these little pieces, no doubt in a factory where you have them being spit out, a zillion at a time or whatever. And then on the right-hand side, we have the metal ore that the little spring is built out of, right? Those are two different substantial causes. But obviously, that is the main stuff, if you will, from which these pieces of a clothespin are formed, and therefore the clothespin is formed in that way from these two main or substantial causes. But of course, there are many, many, many other causes and conditions that play into this. As Thich Nhat Hanh was saying, we could find the whole cosmos in it. But I'm just curious if people want to do a little, shout out of things that you would say are also involved in creating causes and conditions for this clothespin. What are some of the other causes? Yes, Venerable Yangchen. The, yeah, the lumberjack who felled the tree, however those trees were chopped down, needed someone to do it. Absolutely. Anyone else? There's plenty of causes and conditions. You shouldn't be at a shortage. Great. So he has to have a chainsaw. He has to have the knowledge of the training to be able to do that. There's probably more than one person to do this because you need spotters and whatever else is involved. The mother and father that made him, their parents. We could keep going back the whole genealogy back through the history of humanity. All the yeah, the truck that delivered it online. Anyone? Do you have the forest where it came from? Absolutely. Teresa.
I would say that the ground that the tree grew in and the sun and the water and everything
And
that created that tree.
absolutely. Good. Electricity. Electricity is going to be involved one time or another with regard to all of it, right? And especially in the factory where these things are made. Oh, yeah. These aren't just, yeah, produced, they're mass produced, I'm sure. Let's go to the metal part. What about the metal part, the spring? We talked about the metal ore, but what else is all involved in creating metal ore? Lots of causes and conditions there too, right? Anyone? Pardon? The shaping of it, absolutely. It needs to be shaped in that. And probably, again, you got a machine doing that nowadays. Maybe before it was somebody doing it by hand. I don't know. It had to be mined. Yeah, absolutely. And then what was it doing in the mine anyway, in the ground? I mean, that's a whole process of various geological things that cause the formation of metals and metal ore and what have you that could then be mined. Again, you can keep going back and you can just let yourself wander. And we're going to do a little exercise in this. Each of these three levels, we're going to go further. But we can see that even with something as simple as a clothespin, that we can find myriad causes and conditions that gave rise to it. So I always point out that then what that should do is not just, oh yeah, isn't that interesting, and you can teach kids that and just let them, enjoy the fact that everything is interdependent. We have to come back to that, what it's trying to prove. Is there a clothespin that exists independent of those causes and conditions? Because again, we've got to go back to that negation thing. We have to say, okay, well, then what is it leading us to negate by way of affirming that it arises on the basis of all of these? There is no clothespin that exists independent of causes and conditions. It's impossible. Logically, we can come to that conclusion, right? Is there anyone who would come to the opposite conclusion? I mean, seriously, if you really feel like there can be one that exists independent of causes and conditions, I would love to hear that. Kind of takes us into a different place to discuss this, but okay. So let's go to the next level. And this is what we call dependence upon parts. Again, those of you who are online, I've got the parts there. I managed to find a little picture online of the three parts. These are the three main parts. But obviously, when we start talking about parts, parts can be taken down to a much smaller level, right? We can start looking at molecules, atoms, all this that was being discussed in that video that we saw earlier. So we have infinite parts involved in this when it comes down to it. But essentially, what we have when we're at a grosser level are three main parts that can be taken apart in the way that they have been there. And you're certainly welcome to do that with your clothespin if you have one here in the Gompa and want to do that. The one that I have here has gotten a little bit looser because I've used it a number of times. The ones that you have are very new, so they're probably not going to come apart so easily. So don't like mess up your fingers in doing that or something or start bleeding. If you do start bleeding, let us know. We'll make sure. But we essentially have these three parts. Again, maybe you could put the camera, Leah, on mine again so they can see it just a little bit closer. Da, 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 da. Can pin me online. Because is it pinned right now? No, I'm sorry. Because I mean I noticed that it's still showing the spiritual program coordinator. But are you all seeing these really close now, Teresa? Okay, good. All right. I just can't see the pinning on mine for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe because I'm the one pinned by a clothespin. No, I'm just kidding. So again, we have these two wooden pieces, right? They're, identical pretty much. In fact, I'm sure they're identical. They must, not have left and right ones that are in separate bins. They actually have just the two of them they grab and put together by the machine or whoever is doing it. And then, of course, we have this little piece, which has got a little spring and then the little legs there of the spring that hold it in place that allow the clothespin to open and close. So again, these three parts are necessary for a clothespin, right? And there are many, many more parts, obviously, once more at a molecular, atomic, subatomic level, all of this that goes on, right? That's underneath the surface. We have to come back to that question once more. Is there a clothespin that exists independent of its parts? If I went into a store, in one of the, you know, what do they call them, like kind of all-purpose stores or whatever, and I was looking for some clothespins, and I had a bag of these. I bought a whole bag of these. I'd be pretty disappointed, right? Because it's just the one leg. It's just the one piece of the clothespin, right? And if I just went in there and there were a bunch of these, the springs, I'd be pretty disappointed. I wouldn't think I'd gotten a bag of clothespins at all, right? I'd think, what happened here? These aren't really clothespins. We do see that it does depend upon its parts. Now, again, this isn't an absolute thing because if we looked at something like a body, a human body, we wouldn't say that a human body is not a body without certain parts because many people go to war and come back without limbs and what have you. So there's still something that we might call a body, but there's probably some basic elements of it that would have to be there. We have to have some parts for us to be able to call it a body, for us to be able to say that a body exists. So, getting to that question, then, essentially we can say with some assuredness that without the parts, you cannot have the clothespin or whatever phenomenon it is. It cannot exist independent of those parts. I mean, where is the clothespin that doesn't have these three parts? Show it to me, right? Okay. So now let's do the last little level. And this one I'm going to do in the camera so you can see it. All right. So again, is there a clothespin in my hand now based on what we just talked about? All right. Okay. No, I'm going to set it here. Is there a clothespin in my hand now with this second part? Is there a clothespin in my hand now? Now I'm going to take all three of these parts and very simply, again, just mold this around that, mold this around that, nothing up my sleeve. Is there a clothespin in my hand now? Okay, so I didn't add any parts. I didn't add anything that's clothespin. Where is clothespin coming from? Well, I mean, why do you see that there's a clothespin now when before there wasn't a clothespin when we had the three parts? I mean, sure, they're assembled. I'm not denying that. But I didn't add anything, right? There's no clothespin I added, like, oh, fourth part that is clothespin that is, you know, involved in all of this. No, there's just the parts. And then now it takes on the label of clothespin. Causes and effects are there. That's the first level dependent arising. The parts are there. That's the second level dependent arising. What I'm getting at with this third one is this very subtle way that clothespin actually is here by name, by designation, by imputation, labeling, all these terms that we use that are, essentially means a conceptual mind, like mine or anyone else's, is looking at this and determining that this is clothespin. And once more, we do that through conventional agreement so that when we go to the store and we want to buy some clothespins, we go, oh, these are the clothespins I was looking for, and we, happily buy them, and they meet the need, they fill the function, as Bob was alluding to earlier, that they have to have some functionality as clothespins. But this is the slightest, the subtlest way that things actually exist. And they all support that idea that things can't exist independently. But this is important to get to this place where we realize that in the end, everything depends upon the beings who are relating to that base as being that object. Once more, that was the first step that Rinpoche pointed out earlier in what I went through this morning. The base appears to us, these two wooden pegs with the metal clip, metal spring in between. That appears to us, and then we learn the label. That's the very first step. We have to learn what the label is. I mean, I don't know again, most of these things we learned when we were kids, right? My mother would hang things out on the clothesline. I remember my brother, he was quite small. He was a really small kid most of his life. He grew up eventually, but he had one in his little bib or something, bib overalls, and he was walking around and fell, and the clothespin went up and caused like some injury to him. That's one memory I have of clothespins when I was a kid. But we all grew up with various things that we learned the label for. That's that first step. But then, as you saw when I first held it up, it appears to be a clothespin from its own side. It appears to have its own clothespinness. I mean, these words are getting kind of ridiculous, but its identity seems to be established out here. But clothespin, in the end, in this subtlest way, is really just a label we give to this. Jeffrey Hopkins points this out. Maybe this is, I hope I don't make your head explode with this one, but he says that actually what I have in my hand here and clothespin are two different phenomena. Related, because one's the label and the other is that which is labeled. So what I have in my hand here is the basis for a clothespin. Clothespin is the idea we have of it, the designation we give to it, the imputation we make on that basis. And by virtue of that, they are two separate phenomena. Of course, if they were the same phenomena, then things would exist from their own side. They would be established out here. It would have clothespinness that is there absolutely and can be found and has no dependence upon anything else. We would know clothespin the minute we saw this, right? Mother would just show us that and we go, oh, clothespin, and they'd show us this and they go, oh, whoops, sorry. Oh, spoon. I get excited when I start talking about emptiness. But remember when we all were introduced to these things? This is my little, I don't have an iPad. I've got one of these other Lenovo pads or whatever. We have new phenomena all the time, right? These things come into our existence and we learn the label for them. And then immediately, once more, they appear to be what we've designated them as from their own side. It's got its own, tabletness, I guess is the generic term for this, right? It's not an iPad. I remember when the iPads were introduced in whatever year that was. I don't remember the year, but we have an Apple store down in Albuquerque, and the local news people were out there because there were all these people camped out to get this iPad. The announcement was, oh, the new device from Apple iPad. And they were interviewing one man who had been there all night. It was like the morning just before they opened, and he said, "Sir, you've been here all night, waiting for this iPad to be, released." And he says, "Yes, I can't wait to have one." And he says, "Well, do you know what it is? Do you know what the functions of it are? What it's going to?" And he says, "No, but I want one." I mean, so you see how quickly we get like an idea of something, and sometimes that idea may not even be that realistic. But the Buddha says again that we don't have a realistic mind with regard to things anyway, because even at the level of just their mere existence, we are holding to things to have some identity established from their own side. That its iPadness once more seems to cover the whole object, and we can, relate to it in that way. But that's a fiction. iPad is a label we give to this collection of stuff. And iPad and this collection of stuff are two separate phenomena. Again, related in that third way of dependent arising, the label that is being given to the base. And that base has parts, and that base has causes and conditions, and all these dependent factors that are involved in its existence. But at the subtlest level, it's simply our decision to call it a tablet, an iPad, whatever the case might be. So let's put that on the screen, this third level. Um, there it is. Dependence upon, again, we call this mere imputation. By mere, we mean nothing more than imputation. There's nothing from the side of that or this two wooden pegs in the spring that makes it what it is. It is our imputing what it is. Yes, it has a function that it serves, as to Bob's point earlier. We wouldn't put the label of clothespin on the spoon. It just doesn't work. It's not going to serve the same function. But this is labeling or designation by a conceptual consciousness. And once more, conceptual consciousnesses include those, infants who are prelingual, who are essentially, and even animals. Animals do this with regard to what they experience. I mean, I don't know, maybe some animals have subtle language that we haven't picked up. Certainly some birds and what have you seem to be saying things to each other. But they have a mind that is conceptualizing what they are encountering and thinking about it as that. Oh, food. Again, they won't use the word food, but that's how their relationship to it. They're imputing food on that. They're imputing branch on that. They're imputing nest or whatever the case might be. So for us, clothespin, this is a definition I got off the internet. It's a piece of wood or plastic. It's kind of interesting. It says a piece because it's more than a piece. But anyway, we'll let them go on that. A piece of wood or plastic for fastening clothes to a clothesline. And that works perfectly fine as a definition. Now, when it comes to the functionality of clothespin, we actually see that it can do a lot more than that. I mean, sometimes they're useful if you've got a bag of chips or something that you want to close up and you don't have anything else to do it. You can put that on the top of it, right? And then it'll stay fresh and the ants will keep out of it or whatever the case might be, right? I don't know. You can probably do other things with clothespins. I remember I keep seeing those things on the internet at various websites about taking the bread clip with you wherever you travel. Those little plastic bread clips that go on the bread bags. I've never been able to figure out why you want to take one, but I keep seeing it. I just don't want to click on it myself because I'm not sure I really want to go through all the hoops and whistles and whatever to get to the final slide that tells you why you should take one. But nonetheless, I mean, you can probably use this for just clipping papers together or clipping something, here or there. Similar functions, but essentially we designed this, created this as something to hang clothes on the line so that, it can have nice, crisp, clean smelling clothes, from drying out in the sun. So that's my example. I hope it works to some degree. Again, why it's a little weird is because clothespins are not something that we normally have much attachment to, right? Or any delusions around. They're just phenomena that we deal with in our everyday life. Maybe my brother, when he fell on his when he was quite young, he maybe got upset, that he got this, boo-boo from his clothespin that hit his chin or whatever. But usually what we're going to do, and talking about this a little bit later today, is work with objects that we find we have a distorted relationship with. objects that are more attractive to us in particular, because that's where most of our problems start, is we get attached to various things. But why I like using clothespins is because they do neatly come out into, three different parts that we can then reassemble without too much trouble. I don't know, again, some of the clothespins are probably a little tighter than mine is, but so any questions on that idea? Did it get across the way that things exist in these three levels? Again, causes and conditions. I think even science has you know, great confidence in that when it comes to physical causes and conditions. Look at all the research they do around climate change and what's happening and why it's happening and what factors are contributing and so on. That's science's role to some degree. So causes and conditions in and of itself, if we realize the effectiveness of causes and conditions, it doesn't necessarily lead to an understanding of emptiness. But if we take it further and really come to see, well, but how are we looking at things and how do they appear to us? As if they had some independence apart from those causes and conditions. And then, of course, parts, once more, we can do that same investigation. People have a lot of confidence there too when it comes down to it. It's this third level that really does start to take it to another dimension where we really start to realize that, as we did with those other two, we can ask the question, is there a clothespin that exists independent of being labeled clothespin? We do tend to think that way. And that's how things appear, as if it had its own clothespinness and the clothesline bag that my mother had before she took one down, and I learned what this was. At some point in my development, I learned what a clothespin was. It seems, and that's that false appearance again, and how we are clinging to that, as if these things were already that. And we're just learning that. Oh, okay, yeah, that's a clothespin. I can accept that as a clothespin, and it does the function of a clothespin that we've all decided a clothespin should do. So we think there's a real clothespin out there. But as we can see, there's no real clothespin, and especially that third level. There's no clothespin that exists independent of us calling this clothespin, designating this as clothespin. And the same goes for everything that exists, and especially once more the I, which we'll get to before we can, finish today. The I, or the person, this is simply a label. If we do that same thing that I just mentioned, that what I have in my hand here is the basis for clothespin, and clothespin is another phenomenon given to that, well, then what is sitting here on this cushion or on your chair when you're referring to yourself or wherever you're sitting at home, what have you, what is there sitting on that is not the I. The I is another phenomenon that is designated to this. All right? And this is where it should start to kind of go, well then, who am I? Who is this I? The I is nothing more than that. Yes, there has to be a basis. I can't say that I'm in the room when my body and mind aren't in the room. But because my body and mind are sitting here on this chair and this cushion, I can then say that I am here. There's a contingency between these two things. What is being labeled, the mind and the body, and the label that is being given to that, the I. So this is, in the end, how everything exists in this very, very subtle way. But once more, supported by causes and conditions and parts. Those are definitely involved. In fact, it is said that if you do realize even that first level of dependent arising with its full implications, you can get to the same conclusion of emptiness. Because once more, we are talking about refuting anything having any form of independent existence, whether it be independent of causes and conditions, independent of parts, independent of labeling. But in order to really uphold it completely, we do have to get to that third level. We have to understand that things, just go back to what I mentioned that Rinpoche said. Lama Zopa said, it's almost as if things don't exist. If it's just the I that is labeled to this collection of stuff, well, then that's the slightest possible existence. It's what we would call nominal existence versus objective existence. Things existing as from their own side, the object that they are. This is nominal existence. It's existence by virtue of it being named, designated, conceptualized. It's nothing more than that. I don't want to deny the base. We're not saying that I can just impute myself anywhere. And there has to be an appropriate base. Appropriate base for designating a being, an I, a person, would be the body and mind of that person. So we're going to designate I to that, designate, this to that, and all the people in the world all have their own basis and their own identity that is imputed to that basis. The identity doesn't come from the side of the object. There is no real I there. Lama Zopa would often use that phrase, real I, or real clothespin, or real whatever. He didn't talk about clothespin so much. That's something I threw in there, but but this is the way that we see it. We think that things are real in that way, that there's something real from the side of the object. That is the essence of it. We feel like it's really got to be there. That's how it appears. That's how we think of it. But as we can see from these three levels of dependent arising, it doesn't exist in that independent way on its own. So let me open it up here to any discussion or questions on this. You can certainly take it off of the pinning of me if you don't want to continue that. Yes, please, Venerable Yangchen. Oh, yeah, yeah.
So we wouldn't say the mind is in the room and we label ourselves on the mind, but we would have a dead body in here and we would say that person.
Yeah,
I'm just
yeah, yeah. No, it is interesting. You may have heard a little of what Venerable Yangchen said about, when you have a dead body, a dead person. Yeah, it is interesting how people can still. Yeah, it's like, oh, she looks so peaceful. When they go to the wake or whatever, the funeral home or and it is interesting how we attach so much to that. And of course, in our culture, we still think that like, oh, mom's buried down at the cemetery and whatever. And these it is so deeply ingrained in us that we are strongly identifying that phenomenon, again, even just part of it, the body with the mind gone, as that person.
just trying to, I'm thinking back from like
Yeah.
tenants
Uh-huh.
classes and stuff,
Uh-huh.
but I don't remember something being addressed at all with that. They don't talk about it.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you remember anything?
No, I don't. And I don't think that it gets talked about maybe in the Tibetan culture as much as it does in the Western culture, where we have maybe they are raised with such, not attaching the identity to the body so much and recognizing the transitory nature of all of that. One of the things I will mention while we're on the whole subject of emptiness today is that one of the other truths that the Buddha taught that is also really useful to realize before emptiness is what he called subtle impermanence, the fact that everything is changing all the time. This clothespin that I held up to you just a few minutes ago, it's changed every moment since then. But we don't notice it. But again, whether that's happening molecular level, at atomic, subatomic level, the point is that it is not a stationary phenomenon. And that may be pointed out to some degree through that video we saw earlier, that you have all of this movement going on of electrons in a cloud going around the atoms and all of this happening within the sphere of what we see as something quite solid and stationary. But that does start to loosen up some of our perceptions of things as well. And then when we get to the gross impermanence of death and the recognition that nothing that is born continues, it eventually dies. Eventually, this body becomes worm food or, is combusted in uh, a crematorium or whatever. So again, this is the nature of everything too that is produced in our world. All these things that arise from causes and conditions, eventually, disintegrating. But they change over time as well. That subtle impermanence it speaks to, that we can't really grasp at anything that's really that lasting or permanent. So, but we have a lot of confusion around this in the West in particular, holding on to these corpses of beings as if they were, the real person. Oh, and even I have to, I'm not, again, trying to put down any other spiritual traditions at all, but, my mother would talk of this frequently of like, my father passed away, 24 years before her, and she'd like, talk about going to see her husband again, and it's like, well, no, your husband was this being on the basis of that body and that mind and so on. In Buddhist terms, his mind has gone on to whatever other existence was conditioned for, that and based on his prior karma and maybe gone on to another existence. Who knows where that consciousness is? But it's not my dad anymore. My dad's gone. My dad was a phenomenon that existed for the 70 years he was on this planet and now is gone. Yeah. I think in the West, we just have a hard time letting go of people. Like we want to hold on to them like there's something else there that is still them. And of course, some of these traditions do teach us soul, something that is not the body or the mind, that is this separate little piece of God or something. I don't know. I grew up Catholic. I never really understood exactly what an immortal soul was. But we want to grasp at something that's the real person and hold on to that as if it's going to be eternally existing. That actually is this other extreme. We talked about earlier today this extreme where we could think things don't exist at all. You start hearing these teachings, and that's why it's gentler to go with dependent arising, because it doesn't allow you in some way to fall into this extreme of thinking things don't exist at all, because things do exist on the basis of all these factors. But we are in this more eternalistic kind of bent. And this is where we've always been, holding on to things as if there's some sort of set identity there that we can grasp at and that is real. Yes, Janice, you wanted to share something, please.
So I found myself then wondering, what is a clothespin if there's no one there that's imputing it that it's a clothespin?
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought, well, it doesn't really matter from the clothespin side. So, so it's in the mind of the perceiver. So then what is the difference to the person or being perceiving it? If I perceive it as a clothespin,
Mm-hmm.
what's the difference if I see that object, but I'm not perceiving it as a clothespin? I guess that would be prior to having that
Right.
ingrained.
Right. Or before learning the label or whatever. Well, again, it's still going to be some level of imputation. I mean, we don't want to. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, a wonderful book about emptiness that is relatively easy to get your head around, called How to See Yourself as You Really Are. He talks in there about how we can't say that it's just this imputing consciousness that brings that matter into existence. The matter has its own causes and conditions that are involved in it coming into fruition and being whatever that is. But nonetheless, the consciousness is what establishes it with some sense of identity then. So the basis doesn't have the identity. So when this appears to a child, what we call a clothespin, who doesn't know the term clothespin at all and doesn't even know the functionality, maybe they're not aware of, what the mother's doing with putting the clothes out on the line or what have you. They're just seeing it as this object. They're still going to be involved in some level of imputation around it, like grabbing it and going, maybe on the basis of the smoothness that they feel on the sides of the clothespin, or, they might accidentally pull it open and get their finger pinched in it or whatever. So they're going to have some experience of the object that is going to be conditioned by their own conceptual awareness, as basic as it might be. So to your question, I mean, does this exist as clothespin for that child? No, because the child doesn't have any grounds to call it a clothespin or to relate to it as clothespin. We'll see it in that way, and that's the little film I want to show a little bit later, where we tend to see it as, oh, little Johnny's playing with the clothespin. Be careful, he might, swallow it or get his finger pinched in it or whatever the case might be, because that's how we are relating to that. But once more, take that same clothespin. We were talking in the example of a dog, with a pencil or whatever. With a clothespin, it might be similar. If I threw this across the room and there was a dog who really liked to chew things that was in the room here, would run over and go at it and might have a fun time for a while till it gets to the metal clip, the metal spring, and then it's going to go, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? But it's going to relate to this clothespin in a very different way. But once more, you see how I'm even calling it this clothespin. That's because that's how we're seeing it. It's not fixed as clothespin. It can be related to by an infant in a very different way, by a dog in a different way, by an ant that's crawling on it in a very different way. So does it exist as a clothespin for any of those other situations? No, it exists as however those beings are imputing it, how they are thinking about it. So the identity comes from the side of the imputing consciousness. And once more, to some degree, through our conventional agreement that this is what we're going to do with it. I mean, nowadays, people don't, maybe some people still dry their clothes. I know people still dry their clothes, but it's not that common. Everyone's got electric dryers. You go to Europe and everyone hangs their clothes. You know, when I was living in Italy for a while, I was like, there's no dryers. No, there's no dryers. People don't, some, they do have some, but they're much rarer. So essentially, you know, they know these things. They have clothespins and they use them quite frequently. So the identity is quite established. Yeah. So once more, again, it depends upon, you know, the beings who are involved with those bases and how they are referring to them. If you had somebody growing up now who never would hang their clothes, maybe they only know them as something that they buy and they can put on their snacks, you know, to keep their potato chips fresh, you know, keep them from getting kind of moist and awful, right? That may be the only way that they relate to these. And so they might not even think of them in terms of their real, the function that we came up with. Again, not their real function, the function that we've decided that these are to be used for. Does that make some sense? Yeah. Does that help, Janice? Yeah, please. It's a follow-up. Yeah.
Right,
Or,
but what's the difference in the individual? What's the difference if I mean, functionally in the conventional world, I need to be able to identify objects
mm-hmm.
to work with them and to, you know, to name them. But what what benefit is it? I mean, evidently you're seeing reality as it really is, or getting closer and closer to seeing reality as it really is.
Mm-hmm.
What's the benefit
Yeah.
of that? What's that transformation? Or, you know, can you speak a little bit more about that?
And I think that's the harder thing to see from the vantage point of simply engaging in a course like this and starting to get our heads around how things exist in this dependent manner and how they don't exist in this independent manner. But what it said certainly is, and you can get a taste of this as you generate more wisdom around this topic, is that you stop the sort of overlay and the clinging to things, particularly when we get into those two patterns of attachment and aversion or anger. But there's the component to it that I've addressed a little bit, but I haven't referred to as much, and we'll get into this shortly, is this I. You know, this is where we are getting into most of the trouble. You know, when I put the tree of samsara up earlier, I mentioned how the ignorance that's at the root is the grasping at the I and all phenomena to be inherently existent. The main one that's getting us in trouble is thinking that there is this real I. Because once we start imbuing this I with this level of reality and we think that it exists independently on its own, well, then everything we relate to is not together with any of the wisdom that we're talking about. It's through ignorance that we are relating to phenomena. And that's actually how our attachment and our aversion arise, is because there's this I that's at the center of everything that is reified, held up to be existing in this fictitious way. And we're relating to everything as ways of satisfying or protecting that I. And that I doesn't exist. So the idea here is that if we remove that, we can accept in a very subtle way how the I does exist, but that doesn't give any juice to attachment and anger. It doesn't have the ability to do that because you've taken the rug out from underneath all those. Because once more, that's the root of samsara. Everything else is built on that. This, as I said, gets to be harder for us to see. But when you ask, well, what's the benefit? The benefit, I mentioned earlier, like clothespins are not particular objects of attachment or anger. I mean, I've got this one I've traveled with for many years, you know, so maybe if I lost it, I might have a moment of like, oh, I lost my really good clothespin that got nice and loose so that I could take it apart. But then I go, oh, there's plenty more. I'll just, you know, take a new one and I'll get it loose and I'll be able to use it just fine. So they're not really major objects of attachment or anger for us. What we have to begin to apply this to, and I've got some of that in my advice in the slides, which by the way, all these slides will all be made available. I'll send them to Leah and she can make sure that you all get a copy of them, a PDF file with them in it so you can refer to them. But, you know, where it really gets, meaty for us is when we start looking at the objects that we relate to in this erroneous way and that we get entangled with. And we think, oh, I need to have that in my life. And sometimes we even step on other people's toes to get those things. Or I don't want this in my life. And sometimes we get violent and rude on the basis of pushing things out of our life that we don't want. Now, again, it's hard to see the significance of it when we're beginning to sample this and to taste this and investigate it. It becomes more profound after we've repeatedly contemplated it and really thought about it and tried to undermine that strong sense of an I and the strong sense that everything that I relates to exists in this solid kind of concrete way. That's the benefit over time. But yeah, I think it is, in my estimation, in my experience, maybe others have had different experience. I think it's hard to make that jump to kind of go, okay, well, this is an interesting exercise that we're engaging in today. It's a lot of thinking about this and trying that and whatever and looking at clothespins. But what does it have to do with anything? What it has to do with anything is that when we do realize this at a very deep level, for sure, it will undermine all of our existence that is in this conditioned manner and giving us unsatisfactory results. We will be more content and satisfied from having pacified our own minds, essentially. And we can develop our minds further and be able to help others to pacify their minds. Because this is what's driving the whole show, is thinking that these things, ourself and all phenomena around us, exist in this independent, concrete way. So, any follow-up from that, Janice? No. Okay. So be patient. I mean, the one thing, and Venerable Yangchen brought up, there was a wonderful verse from Aryadeva in his 400 stanzas where he says something to the effect of like, even just a bit of doubt, even just to let in that, entertain that thought that maybe things don't exist in the way they appear. That's enough to, as they say, like kind of shake the rafters of cyclic existence, like to begin to upset the whole structure. So even just being here today, if you don't get anything from today, from all of my blah, 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 and all of this that I'm doing, but just the idea that maybe things don't exist in the way they appear. Maybe there's something going on here that I'm blind to. That's enough to begin the process of exiting this whole nonsense. So, hallelujah. Again, we can be very happy that we have these teachings that can begin that process, getting us into investigating things and not taking everything for granted. As I said earlier, that must be one of the, if we really look at it, the most difficult things for us to take in is that most beings are just not even questioning the nature of reality. I mean, I'll tell a little story. This isn't meant to like talk about me, but I started with an organization called Rigpa with Sogyo Rinpoche. And what was interesting is I studied with them for about 2, 3 years and I never heard the word emptiness. And I was like, okay, well, I get these teachings about, bodhicitta and compassion and all this. It sounds like a great way to live your life. And I went to Sechen Ling, our center in San Francisco, in the beginning of 1996. And Venerable Rabina was teaching a class on like getting to know your mind, minds and mental factors and all this. And she was using Jeffrey Hopkins' book, Meditation on Emptiness. And I was like, emptiness? I've never heard of this. And I was so intrigued by this book. I mean, it's not a beginner's book. I don't know what karma I had, but I picked it up and I was like, oh my gosh, this is what's really going on. Like there's something that is causing all of this. There's something that I can point to and say that's what the problem is. And I wasn't getting that from the other teachings. It was kind of interesting. So I hope that there's something sparking in each of you. Some of you have been around the Dharma quite a while, but something that's sparking you to say, I want to know what that's about. I want to know if I'm not seeing things correctly, then please correct me. Help me to see things more accurately. Help me to actually undermine what's causing all of my problems. I mean, this is part of why people go to psychotherapy often, right? Because they've got some patterns of looking at things and working with things that are not so healthy for them, and their relationships are going bad and whatever, and they want to heal things that they haven't really understood and developed from their past. And so they go to a therapist to do that, right? Well, the Buddha's the ultimate therapist, and Venerable Bina says he's the first cognitive behavioral therapist, who's essentially telling us, to look at our minds and our behavior and make adjustments in accord with what is more true, more in line with reality. So if nothing else, I hope that comes out of our time together today. It's so important, so great benefit. Might not get all of it right in the moment right now from a single day of looking at this topic or however long you've spent, but over time it will accumulate and you'll have deeper insight. They say that when there was one example of a monk who, I think it was this, who was listening to Lama Tsongkhapa, I think was teaching, got some teaching from Lama Tsongkhapa, and he began to see that he didn't exist in this concrete way, and he grabbed at his robes to like, but am I here? Am I no longer here? It should kind of feel like that. They say that's actually a really good sign that there's a little bit of fear arising about losing this I, this sort of ego that we've been so attached to. Yeah. Yeah, that uneasiness, and I mean, it means you're hitting the target because this is something that is so deeply ingrained in us. Like I said earlier today, like the water that the fish is swimming in or whatever, it's something that we are so habituated towards of believing in that I that when things start to negate that, to deflate it, that we don't see it there anymore, it's really scary. It's like, what am I letting go of? The teacher in the master's program, or teaching assistant in the master's program, Jumpa Gendon, you mentioned tenets earlier. There are these different philosophical tenets. The Buddha did teach different things at different times, and he taught more profound things at certain times that are getting at this truth that we're working with, the final truth that the Buddha taught. But he taught many other things that are more provisional. They're just to kind of help you get along the way. He used the example of like you're going into a very deep lake and you're starting at the shore where you're not underwater at all. And you go further into the lake and you get to a point where you're like, up to here. And then he says, what we hold on to as our life preserver is this false sense of a self. We're holding on to that to kind of keep us afloat. And so you eventually have to let that go. That doesn't exist. That is something that you're holding on to out of habit and can be undermined, through this wisdom. Yes, Bob, please. Yeah. Yeah, to go to that place of them, what is here, or kind of. Yeah, and again, that's why once more the danger is when we start to get to that place where we say, well, what is here? As Bob's, saying that will be a natural place we fall to. If we think there's nothing, that's again one of these extremes that's not going to get you on the right track. If we hold on to it, oh, but no, I am still here in this concrete, independent way, well, then we're going to fall over here. That's why view is often called the middle way. It's like this middle between these two extremes, these two really outrageous thoughts. Things don't exist at all, kind of a nihilistic bent. And then this more eternalistic thing, thinking, well, no, there is, grandma's still there, and grandma's in heaven, and grandma's there. No, grandma's gone. Grandma was this phenomenon of this mind with this body, and now that mind's on to some other existence. There's a thread of consciousness that runs through all these lives, don't get me wrong, but that's not even the real person, right? Because that's just this arising of mental moments and various phenomena you're experiencing on the basis of having grandma's body and then on the basis of having, whatever body follows from that and so on. There's no real eternal kind of lasting I. Okay, well, I've gone into a whole lot of different directions than what I thought I was going to at this point. Aaron has a question. We will use the microphone in here, and maybe it does amplify it enough for folks to hear at home on Zoom. But please, Aaron.
There was an online teaching from Conjola, and Lindsay knows this teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And I related to the fact that she mentions that your ego has to be harmed somewhat to be able to, like with the grasping of the robes, that
Mm-hmm.
kind of resonated with me because it does kind of hit you that way, that your ego has to be harmed for you to change or see things differently somehow.
That's beautiful teaching. Yeah. And I think there's that truth to it that we have to, again, deflate or in some way puncture that sense of ego and self that is driving the whole show. That's where, again, undermining our grasping at clothespins as inherently existent isn't quite as effective. And that's why, as I said, they generally say start with realizing the lack of the I existing inherently or independently or intrinsically or whatever terms we want to use. Negate that first, because that's really what's running the show. That's what's keeping us going from life to life, is grasping at a sense of a eternal kind of identity and not wanting to let that go. So we have to do some damage to it. We have to inflict something upon it, because it's pure fiction. Yeah. So when Venerable Yangchen saying, when you're being criticized or yelled at, then you see that come up really pretty strongly. And they even say that that's one of the times we can see how what we're grasping at. The real me that is so offended that you would say something like that to me. How dare you? Yeah, yeah. Yes, please, Leah.
Yeah. I was thinking earlier today, we were meditating and Venerable Yangchen was talking about aspiration. And we were
Uh,
talking about how the goal is to have your aspirations be positive for yourself, but not harm anyone else. And I was thinking about that in terms of this conversation and emptiness, and actually feeling a sense of relief of, if there is no I, um, then like there isn't an opposition there, or like there's nothing that I could do that would be harmful to another being,
mm,
that would be actually beneficial to me. And I
mm,
feel like in our culture, that's sort of the way it's framed, of like, you got to get a leg up on everyone. And I
right.
think that there's an immense amount of relief to see, oh, there is no there's no me that is independent of anyone else here. So then there's nothing I could do that would benefit me that would harm anyone else, or vice versa. And
Absolutely. No, that's a good point, Leah. Yeah. So I don't know, again, online, are you hearing what people are saying with the microphone? Okay, good, good. It does sound like there's some, so I don't have to repeat, but there's Master Shantideva in his chapter. It's his chapter on patience, actually. It's not the one on wisdom, but in patience, he talks about how, like, we make a decision to only see this sense of an I in relation to a very limited part of all of existence. And if we can think of other as I, then we would be just as interested in removing their suffering, because it's what we were kind of extending this sense of self beyond that. I mean, and we're not talking about this fictitious self with that, but we're just getting out of that trap that we're in, of thinking we're enclosed in this little me that's independent over here, standing all alone, and bringing our sense of concern for other beings outside of the scope of what we normally relate to as being me. He uses the example of, like, why would my hand care if there's a thorn in my foot? If there's a thorn in my foot, my hand isn't experiencing any of the pain. So why does my hand go down there and pull the thorn out of my foot? And you might say, well, that's all the same continuum, right? There's the Don's consciousness that is feeling the pain of the thorn, and Don's consciousness is telling the hand to go down there and pull it out. But that's something, again, we decide. We can enlarge our sense of concern. We don't have to feel like we're in this little bubble all by ourselves. That's another thing that emptiness can help to do, is to help to remove some of that feeling of that we're unconcerned about the suffering of others. We should be as concerned about the suffering of others, simply because it's suffering. It doesn't have to do with whether it's ours in that concrete way or theirs.
Amazing.
Mm,
When you start thinking about concept of emptiness, or is this idea of non-duality as opposed to duality.
mhm.
And so that, but maybe I'm bringing in too many different words
It's
here, but
okay.
it's the same thing in that, you know, when you're not grasping, you see how everything is interdependent.
Yeah.
When you see that you're grasping and that you're suffering and that all beings are suffering, then you have more, then you can see more the compassion side.
Mhm.
Emptiness links into the compassion side.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They
No, no, no. You're making a good point, and that's where they do say that, again, the emptiness and the wisdom of emptiness does support the compassionate side of it, the connection to others, and the feeling of getting out of that once more, that sense of an isolated self, that when we see the interdependence of things, well then, I think Jan Willis said this in the same video I was talking about, where he said, if I see that that person is really a part of me, and then how could I harm that person? How could I do anything to that person? How could I even harm my environment when my environment is intimately involved with me? You know?
Emptiness or the non-duality, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We don't see it in that term as of duality before. Yeah. So let's do a little exercise. I don't know how this is going to work. I've never really worked with a whiteboard before. I want to introduce a little exercise that with the whiteboard. Let's see how this works. New whiteboard. It's all showing up on there. Hopefully you're all seeing it at home. This is a little exercise. Remember, do you remember singing The Farmer in the Dell? I'm not going to ask you to sing it. I just want to know if, oh, whoops, I got to go to text first. Text. Then let's go here. Does everyone remember the line in there that the cheese stands alone? Okay, so we're going to work with an exercise that's called The Cheese Doesn't Stand Alone. And we're going to see how long this goes. We won't have to do it for more than a few minutes. But I want to kind of from the where cheese is on the screen and above is where we put the causes that lead to cheese. All the causes and conditions that are involved in creating cheese. I mean, and we can work with vegan cheese if you want to. I don't know how many vegans are in the room, but otherwise we can certainly just go with, our regular old milk cheese, cow cheese. And then this might be the more challenging part of it. From cheese going down is what happens to cheese after we eat it. Okay. Lots of causes and conditions there, but it kind of gets into this whole continuity of what we call cheese. That is just a designation that we're making again in relation to various causes and conditions that precede it and that follow it. Does that make some sense? Anyway, we'll do this a little bit. Okay, so thank you for putting milk on there, whoever put milk on. Okay, milk we can see is maybe the more substantial cause of cheese, right? Because it is through the milk and the milk fat that then you then have, that going into the producing cheese. Does someone in the room here want to add anything? Enzymes, okay. So enzymes, let's put that over here. And I think I have to do this text. So what was another one? Sorry, okay, fermentation you're putting in. What was another one? Air. Okay, thank you, air. Somebody's faster at this than me. Again, I haven't really used this so much, this feature. Um, Temperature. Okay, so you have well, we're just putting enough up there to have some idea. So we start to see that it's like so many things going on that we're just isolating one little piece of like a whole process of causes and conditions. What about grass? Can we put grass on there? The cow. Of course, we have the people, well, again, a lot of cows, unfortunately, are factory farm, but we have farmers or some sort of people involved in that process. So the sun is involved, absolutely, creating the grass. Time. Time plays a role. Let's put time on there. Again, we don't have to put these all like in some kind of order. I always had this vision of like doing this, and because we're online, I didn't want to do it in this setting, but like having a huge amount of these flip chart paper things with just cheese in the middle and then all these little lines that go between everything. And you can do lines on here too, but I think it gets too complicated. People are getting the gist of what we're talking about. As we put more and more things into this top part, we see that there are so many causes and conditions that are contributing to cheese that once more, it doesn't stand alone. It doesn't have an ability to exist on its own, independent of those factors. Let's entertain a few things on the bottom part here. So we're going to have, let's say we're going to have teeth involved in this. You're going to eat with your teeth. Pardon? The bottom part is everything that happens with cheese as it moves into its next phase. Let's just use those terms. It essentially, we know what it becomes feces eventually, right? You know, or mold if you don't eat it. But let's assume we're going to eat it. Okay. More enzymes. Okay, so we got human enzymes going on here. Enzymes. Whoops. Enzymes. Um, Acid. Okay, good. Stomach acid, what have you. Whoops. We have microbacteria. Good. Okay. Whoops. Okay, good. Okay, so we'll put the absorption of amino acids, etc. Acids, nutrients. Yeah. Aminco. How did I do that? Amino. Okay. Um, okay. Again, I mean, this just entertaining the idea that when we have something that we call cheese, it's in this continuum of causes and conditions that lead it to be called cheese, and it serves the function of cheese. And then when it goes from there into our mouths, all sorts of other processes are changing it. I remember one teacher I had at Seichenling shortly after I started studying Geshe Wangdu. Remember Geshe Wangdu? He was like a teacher for the three Bay Area centers for a while. Anyway, he said, "Where is the apple that you had for lunch today?" Like, just that question, like, where is that apple that you had for lunch, or the whatever it was that you ate? Where is that cheese that you ate 5 minutes ago, or whatever? It's like, the identity of things changes really quickly. And what it is after it's already gone into our mouths is much different than as it goes through the alimentary canal and has all these various things working on it and digesting it and absorbing the nutrients and everything else. And then as it comes and exits the body in a totally different form. I mean, obviously, it's a huge change, right? It's no longer anything we would refer to as cheese. Were you going to share something, Tyler?
Yeah, I've had this thought before with food. Like, is the cheese also my eyeballs, or is it a supporting factor? Because I don't know if cheese
Oh,
is the dependent arising for my eyeballs to exist, but it's kind of in there, right?
yeah, I mean, again, all of what we eat has nutrients that go into it, and then of course we even relate to cheese through our eyes seeing it, through our tongue tasting it, our nose smelling it, and so on. Even the tactile sensation of chewing cheese. Well, my parents grew up in Wisconsin, so we grew up in Wisconsin that they have cheese curds there. You know what cheese curds are? They're really, the texture of them is totally different than cheese, but so again, we have an interrelationship with all of this, and we could put many different factors, again, almost infinite factors on the whiteboard there that contribute to the creation of cheese and to what happens after cheese. Because, even once it comes out of the body as feces, well, then it doesn't stop there. That feces goes down the toilet and goes to a waste factory and da 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 da. I mean, we don't want to necessarily think about everything that happens there. But there are many people involved on that end of the process, if we want to call it that. Okay. Let's go ahead and stop the whiteboard. Uh, there we go. Okay. So again, one of the meditations that we can do, and we'll see if we got time to do this later this afternoon, is where we do really start picking apart some of this in terms of causes and conditions with regard to things that we find as objects of attachment. Maybe for some of you it is cheese, but many of us it might be like that delicious cake from Gail's that was here yesterday for the, after the puja. I mean, all these things, again, we can begin to pick them apart, and hopefully that lessens to some degree our attachment to them in this more solid, self-existent kind of way, thinking that that cake or that cheese or whatever is there on its own, self-established, and then is ultimately this, source of happiness that we can, imbibe and create all these sort of pleasurable feelings and what have you. And again, it doesn't deny that you're going to get the pleasure out of eating the cake. It just means you're going to relate to the cake in a lot healthier way because you're not going to be grasping at it to have that identity from its own side. Let's do, I was going to, I'm just trying to be conscious of time too. I think I can do another exercise or video. I think it's a video that I wanted to do next. So again, that was the exercise for this. I don't know. Sometimes I try to be too cute. I apologize for that. But I started thinking about that whole nursery rhyme. It was kind of an interesting thing. I hadn't really realized what that rhyme was all about, but it was usually kids in a circle, and you would end up pairing up with people, the farmer and his wife, the farmer, and you'd have all this people pairing up, and the cheese was left alone. How horrible for the poor cheese. But maybe that's the three blind mice. Yeah, this is. I don't remember all the lyrics. I looked them up for this just to get the gist of it. Can I use the cheese stands alone and does it make any sense? And it really does. It's like, no, the cheese doesn't stand alone. You may not have the most luck with being paired off with something else, but okay. I was going to show a couple of videos here and we'll see how this works. But this is a dependence upon parts. And I found it kind of interesting. One of the videos I've shown previously around this topic is how a piano is made. But I think perhaps most of you have cars, I imagine, and you probably have some attachment to your cars. I know some people have real attachment to them, like they can't bear the thought of that first scratch on a new car or whatever. But, we have some dependence upon our cars, so it's good to maybe take a look at them. But the first video I ever saw that really kind of where this registered for me was there was a longer film that was about the making of a particular Steinway piano. They even gave it its number. It was like L1067 or something at that particular piano. And so they were in the factory from the moment that the process began, where they take these pieces of wood and they start creating the body of a grand piano. And what I want you to do as you watch this is as the car is being made, see where you start thinking of it as car. I mean, there are parts of a car that are coming together and processes that are involved. It's involved with causes and conditions too, but I really want you to focus on parts and see at what point does it become car for you. It's kind of like the clothespin, right? If you only have like two of the parts, well then do we think of it as clothespin? We'll try this and see how this works. The other video is when a car is disassembled and made into scrap, which is kind of an interesting one. But we'll see if there's time for that one or not. We're getting close to our break here, and this is about a 5-minute video, and I think it should be still be sharing the sound. Let's hope. No, I'm not hearing any sound. Okay, is the sound off in here? Or I didn't set it up this way. Sorry, that's my fault. Because I kept thinking it was the same session as before, but we changed it. I came back into Zoom. Sorry, there we go, share sound. The music is kind of obnoxious on this one, so you might not want to turn it all the way up. I told you. more like the car now. Okay, maybe we can stop there. So it was interesting. There was that caption that said 3,000 to 4,000 parts. But yet when we look at a car, we think of it as a unitary thing, right? I mean, that's my relationship, my car. It's a single car. I don't have two cars in my driveway. I have a car. So again, there's this idea that we're not really getting the full picture when we're only looking at that phenomenon and thinking it has some sort of carness that is established there that's independent of all of these parts. Did anyone notice anything in terms of when you started seeing it as a car? I mean, maybe it wasn't until the very end, and that's oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Once it had that kind of shape, then that was a suitable basis for imputation of car. Because I was back on that film, I think it was called Note by Note, this Steinway piano that they were making. I found that I was already even thinking of it as a piano just by that shape, in a grand piano shape of the wood that they bend so that it can eventually be in that position. But obviously, there are many other processes involved and parts and what have you that contribute to creating a piano. So again, just an interesting exercise. This one's a little bit shorter, but this is what we'll do just before we take our break, is just look at a car now being disassembled. And then see here, maybe perhaps where you lose your...
After priming and painting, the body is sent for polishing. This room has bright lights so that
Stop this.
the mechanics can see even...
Got to go back here. I forgot to do that. Let me get out of this. And what was the question? Well, see when the car disappears for you. I don't know. Yeah. Is there a car? I mean, when we say parts of a car, what are we talking about? You know, what is the car that they are parts of when they're just parts? Just like the parts of a clothespin. Does the clothespin exist when the parts are not assembled into the clothespin or the car or whatever the case might be? So absolutely, you know, that interdependence. So this one is kind of interesting. This is in the UK.
Once your car arrives at the site, as a registered ATF, by law, they have to strip the car of any harmful products or chemicals, along with removing any parts from the vehicle they see as valuable or suitable for recycling. The first step any site takes is removing the wheels from the car. The wheels are removed and then the tires are removed from the wheel itself. The tire will then be recycled to become anything from AstroTurf to underlay, whilst the wheels themselves will be recycled, sold or melted into ingots to be molded into a myriad of things. The next step would be to then remove other parts of the car that can either be sold or recycled. These include the lights and the wing mirrors. The arguably most important step when scrapping a car is the depollution process. The fuel is removed by puncturing the fuel tank using a spike and is collected in a drum to then be recycled. Following this, the car is then lowered, and the power steering fluid, coolant, and engine oil are removed via a pump and stored in vats. Once the depollution process has been completed, the car will then be taken on a forklift to the crane to be crushed. Initially, the crane operator crushes the roof by flattening it into the main body of the car. This makes it more easily fit within the baler. The crane operator then flips the car onto its roof and removes the back axle due to it being a higher grade of steel. They then remove the engine due to many components consisting of other, more valuable materials, such as copper and aluminium. The operator then places the car into the baler. This machine crushes the car into the smallest possible volume, meaning it takes up less room when stored. The baled car is then stored and later sold at a price per ton. All parts of this process are essential in requiring that the site adheres to the rules and regulations of being a registered ATF site and attain the most value from their products.
Left and right. Okay. All right. So let's stop that share. So again, I found it interesting in this one, the narrator was calling it a car all the way through, right? Then the car is bailed, and then the car is, you know. But if we go back to that idea of what Bob had rightly said, I mean, does it serve the function of a car? Even, you know, what Tyler was seeing when he saw it having the shape of a car, or what I saw with the piano when it had that shape in the film I was talking about, they don't really have the function of that at that time, right? They're just something that we can see some resemblance to the finished product. And just like with the clothespin, where I said, you know, you don't want to, you know, get a whole bag of just the one peg of the clothespins, you would be ridiculous. Same with the car. You know, you wouldn't want to get a car that's been baled like that. It's just a big lump of metal. You go, oh, that's not a car. I can't use that as a car. Can't get to work in that. It will fit in the garage probably a lot easier. Yeah. So again, we do have that tendency of seeing things in kind of totally ignoring all these other factors that come into play, the causes and conditions as well as the parts, and not recognizing the dependence that they have upon all of those. And again, maybe one or two parts you could do without. You know, if something falls off your car that's not so essential, then you might do okay for a while. But that's still not getting in the way of the fact that a car depends upon its parts. It does need a requisite amount of parts in order to be established as a car. And the same again with causes and conditions. Can't exist independent of those. So again, these are just little video experiments to see what comes up for people. I'm curious, you know. Any other observations on that before we take our little half-hour break? Yes, please, Teresa.
I'll just give a funny cheese example. When I was a little
Okay.
girl, we lived by a place called the Cheese Factory. And in between, so we'd walk from our house to the beach, and the cheese factory was there. So we'd go to the beach, we'd play at the beach all day, and then we'd get hungry. So we'd go back and eat the cheese. They would put out, you know, cheese for us to sample. That's what they're called. And so one day they kind of caught on to us, I think, because we went to the beach, we played, we went up to eat the samples, and they put out this really yucky tasting cheese. And I, as a little girl, I had no idea there was yucky tasting cheese. So anyway, it was like if I had understood, or somebody had had any teachings on emptiness, then that would have been really helpful for me. There's my cheese example.
That's a great one. Yeah, again, because we do have this way of identifying things in a particular light. is, oh, cheese, cheese. I like cheese. I like cheese. And then you get something that's like gorgonzola. And as a kid, you probably like, oh my God, what is that? That's horrible. I can't eat that. That's not cheese. Yeah, good example. And again, as an adult, maybe you find that the cheeses you ate when you were a kid, like American slices or something, are just not doing it, and you'd rather have the gorgonzola or something that's a little more refined. And so, once more, everything changes. Everything isn't kind of a static phenomenon. I remember I grew up not really liking, I like some vegetables, but I had some that where I was just like, ugh, nothing to do with them, like Brussels sprouts. I just did not want to taste a Brussels sprout. And now I love them. So, so could you change if things were fixed in their identity? Would you have a different relationship with them if they were always the way that you perceived them at that moment in time? Again, cheese, our relationship to cheese changes over time. Our relationship to food, our relationship to any of these phenomena that we get involved in changes over time. Think about the music you listened to when you were growing up. My God, I wouldn't want to listen to most of that music now. Probably almost all of it. Maybe the Beatles a little bit, but that's about it, right? Everything is, again, not fixed in nature. I might mention that that's the reason why we can become Buddhas, because our minds are not fixed in nature. Our minds lack any of that inherent existence, so we can change our minds. We can get rid of what is negative and increase what is positive because of emptiness. If it wasn't for emptiness, it wouldn't be possible. There's a wonderful phrase from Master Nagarjuna, who wrote extensively on this middle way view, where he says, for the person for whom emptiness is possible, everything is possible. For the person for whom emptiness is not possible, nothing is possible. And he doesn't mean that there are people that emptiness doesn't exist for. He means that if you do not really hold the view of emptiness and understand it, then nothing's possible in a sense. You can't really achieve what it is that you want to achieve. Whereas if you hold that view, then everything is possible. We can change our minds, change our experience. Any other comments? Yeah, Aaron, please. Maybe we'll get the microphone.
Hope I'm not sharing too much, but I wonder how imagination plays a role in this. I feel like sometimes imagination can be a vehicle to seeing that something isn't necessarily real, but it's something your mind is coming up with, like illusions or things like that, but grasping on them, but just having them as a way.
Sure. I mean, in what I will say is in the tantric path, where we get into the more esoteric teachings of the Buddha, imagination or visualization plays a huge role in terms of what you're doing in that path is you're trying to think of your future Buddhahood in the moment right now. So you visualize yourself, imagine yourself as a Buddha, using a archetypal, if you will, figure of a Buddha, such as Green Tara or, Thousand-Armed Chenrezig or whoever. I mean, all these wonderful Buddha figures that we have that are sort of templates for our own enlightenment. So imagination and visualization play a great role there. And once more, that is all possible because there's nothing fixed in this. We can purify our experience and have that type of body, have that type of experience. So yeah, I think it plays some role. I'd have to think about it in terms of other roles it might play on a more like sutra level as opposed to the tantra level. But absolutely, if we can imagine things. I mean, look at how things are created. I was, pointing to my tablet earlier. I mean, that shows human imagination at work right there, right? You know, people who come up with the ideas to create all these various things that are technological advances. So I think it's a factor that plays a role in terms of how things come into existence and are established. And yeah, but beyond that, I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe we can talk about that later. But let's take our little break. We're already a few minutes after, sorry. So somewhere around 3:35 or so, we'll aim for that. About a half hour from now, we'll reconvene. Unless people want less time. I mean, it's really, I think take a half hour.